Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. Hope that you're all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is August 5th. If you'll indulge me in this opening segment, I want to give you guys a little bit of a life update for me, so you're aware of what's going on behind the scenes as far as the podcast goes. I am currently planning on moving into my Philadelphia apartment, my new apartment, this coming weekend. I mentioned it a couple episodes ago when I was moving some of my stuff, but now I am officially moving in. So because of that, there is not going to be an episode from me this coming Sunday while I'm moving everything in. I will be back next week, so I'll only be missing one episode. You don't have to worry. But I would recommend, if you feel like you're missing out on something that weekend and you aren't already, to go listen to some of Shub and Elizabeth's episodes. They are excellent. They are very smart and have some very entertaining opinions. I would also like to say, because of the fact that I'm moving, there's a lot of dust flying around my place, which means my allergies are really acting up right now, which includes a pretty severe sore throat. So I'm going to be working through the pain right now, but I may not be quite as enthusiastic as I normally am for these episodes. I'm hoping that it only lasts a couple days once I'm finished moving in, so hopefully by next week it'll be fine. But right now, definitely feeling a little bit under the weather. This is a pretty common occurrence for me, so I am very confident that it is not COVID-19. I know that is still a genuine concern, and I'm monitoring things, but I'm also taking the necessary safety precautions, so I'm pretty confident that it is not that. And I hope that you guys are taking the safety precautions as well, staying healthy, staying happy, staying safe, and I hope that I can provide some sort of distraction or entertainment for you guys during this really chaotic time. And some of that distraction will maybe include today's episode. So let's get into what today's episode is. I'm very excited. It's a pretty different episode. I know I say that fairly often, but I just try and keep things diverse. I want every episode to be a little bit different. So this episode is going to focus primarily on one filmmaker. His name is Alex Garland. He's one of my favorite filmmakers working today. And the first movie I'm talking about, which is sort of the newer film, is actually not even really a film. So I was contemplating whether or not to talk about this, but I was really interested in it earlier on in quarantine. And it's a mini-series. But miniseries really kind of tiptoe the line between film and television. And this one definitely lies kind of in the world of film, particularly because Alex Garland is the writer, director, creator. And so I thought it would still be very fitting to talk about this. It's something that I really, really highly recommend. It definitely serves its narrative in terms of a pretty concise film arc, even though it is roughly 8 hours long. Just a really long movie if you want to think about it that way. So that one is a Hulu original FX joint production called Devs, which I really, really loved, and I'll get to talk about that in my first segment. The second one, my weekly watch, is a first-time watch for me, and it's one of Alex Garland's writing credits. He did not direct the film, so it's one of his earlier movies, but it's called Dredd, a remake of Judge Dredd from the 90s with Sylvester Stallone. And then my weekly recommendation, if you are in tune to any of the stuff that I tend to like and are in tune to who Alex Garland is, you may expect this recommendation, but it is Ex Machina. It is one of my favorite films of all time, one of A24's most popular films at the time of its release. It's a movie that I really, really adore, and I can't wait to recommend it to you guys. And in the final segment, 2 episodes ago, right? Yeah, 2 episodes ago, I talked about some of the stuff that had happened in July in terms of the film industry, and I want to kind of do that again, except instead of looking back, I'm going to be looking forward. So I know because COVID-19 has sort of messed everything up, you may be confused about what movies are still slated to come into theaters, given that theaters aren't even open yet. And honestly, I'm pretty confused too. You may be in the same boat as me. There's a lot of movies that were planned this year that have now been rescheduled to 2021. So I'm going to go over the list of big blockbuster movies or just major motion pictures that are still slated to come out in 2020. So within the next couple months, basically, and I'll give you some of my thoughts and maybe some extra information that I happen to have, just so you guys know what is potentially coming out. That obviously is subject to change given everything that is going on, but maybe not. Hopefully we'll get to see those movies this year. So that's today's episode. I'm really, really excited about it. I'm really hyped to talk about Alex Garland, one of my favorite creators. So let's get it started. All right, so Devs is a miniseries, an 8-episode miniseries on Hulu, exclusive to Hulu. It's a venture between Hulu and FX after Disney bought Fox, and they own a large stake in Hulu. It was fairly inevitable that something like this was going to happen, but all of FX's library is now on Hulu, and they are coming up with some exclusive television shows. This one is created, written, and directed by Alex Garland. It stars Sonoya Mizuno, Nick Offerman, Jin Ha, and Allison Pill. And the official sort of synopsis of the show is a computer engineer investigates the secretive development division in her company, which she believes is behind the disappearance of her boyfriend. So right off the bat, it's a pretty darn intriguing premise. I was super excited about this one because for a long time, I've considered FX to be my favorite television network, and also just the one that is coming out with consistently the best television that's not sort of a paid for subscription service like HBO maybe. This one kind of negates that, given that it's a Hulu exclusive, but regardless, I think this show is phenomenal. It came out episode by episode, so it wasn't like a binge watch. It did come out weekly back in March, April. So this was one of the ones that I watched weekly that I was very excited about, kind of kept me going through the early days of quarantine. And I know I'd said earlier, it's a little bit odd to be talking about a technical television series in a movie podcast, but a lot of times miniseries television in general right now is definitely moving to a more cinematic look and feel, really focused on trying to emulate film, because of the fact that you can kind of do that now. A lot of productions have that budget, and miniseries in particular are focused on creating one narrative arc, much like a film, just so happens to be a lot longer, and there is sort of the confines of episodic television. But if you look at it in a narrative structure of the entire arc, because it's not really focused as much on the individual episodes and more of the entire series arc, you can definitely look at it in terms of story structure in the same way that you would look at a film. So I definitely consider this one pretty much a long film. I know I log a lot of my films onto Letterboxd. I could explain that at some point if anybody is interested, but I know a lot of film people already know what it is. It's a social media service that you get to kind of talk about movies, log the movies that you watch, rank them, and whatnot. And so this one appears on that service. So a lot of miniseries definitely do that, and this is no exception. So I adored this series. I loved it. I think it is a phenomenal, just concise narrative. I think everybody in it did a fantastic job. I think this is one of Alex Garland's crowning achievements. I've liked almost everything that he does. Ex Machina, far and away, is my favorite. I don't think this tops that by any means, but I would probably put this in contention for maybe number 2. I did really like Annihilation, but this one really has a very clear philosophy. There's a really original, creative ideas and definitely creative how they're conveyed. So we're going to start with the screenplay. And so the screenplay, every episode really keeps its secret for as long as possible, which I thought was really, really smart. Cause this is kind of a sci-fi drama, cause Alex Garland likes to work in terms of, in like the confines of sci-fi. So that was definitely to be expected. But in the benefits of having episodic television is that you can have an overarching narrative and you can leave a lot of questions unanswered for a very long time. And so that definitely comes into play here. There's a lot of secrets, a lot of twists and turns, and they're ones that are hinted at and almost overtly shown to you very early on. At least the environment or philosophy behind them might be shown early on, but the context of everything you may not be fully aware until the very end, if at all. And so I think that the reveals come at the right times. There tends to be one big reveal per episode, but there's also just a couple mini reveals, whether it be character dynamics or whatnot, different things that the company may be working on, because it does take place at like a tech company. It definitely reminds me of a Facebook, Google type company that runs a lot of different things and just has a lot of different programmers and a lot of different researchers doing different things in the same environment. And I think that's somewhat what it's modeled after. I also think that because of the fact the reveals come at the right times, there is a very steady rise in tension. It definitely is a slowly paced show. But regardless, the later on the series gets, the more exciting it gets. And obviously that's something that you want from something like this that is somewhat of a psychological thriller inspired show or movie. And so the fact that that comes into play is obviously something that is a positive. So I would like to point that out. I also think the most compelling part of this show is the characters and how they're written. The characters are fantastic because this is a premise that can get somewhat convoluted, somewhat difficult to understand at times, but you never really lose any understanding of what the motivation of any of the characters are once they're laid out for you. And that goes both along with how the screenplay is laid out and also the acting, which I'll get into in just a second. I think my favorite part of this show by far is the villain, he's sort of a villain. He's definitely falls into the role more of antagonist, so not necessarily an archetypical villain, but definitely a foil to the main character, and that is Forrest, played by Nick Offerman. He is he's sort of the head of this company, so think Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, that type of businessman who owns this giant tech conglomerate. And so he plays a very shielded character who we get to see. We don't have to see the entire series through the eyes of the lead, which is really nice. I'm glad that that's the case. So we really get to see some moments with Forrest alone or with somebody who may not be a main character. And when he lets his shield down is just a moment in the story that really shines through because of the fact that he has his shield up almost all of the time, and really creates a sympathetic villain, even though he is, I hesitate to say evil, because of the way it's written. It's so nuanced, but definitely somebody who has some pretty malice, intentions or just malicious events, that he creates just solely based on his philosophy of the world. And so I didn't make this show. Alex Garland and the team really creates this villain who you feel for even more so than most, I would say. I think that he really falls into a category of his own, and he's definitely my favorite film antagonist from this year. All of the characters though are very complex, and that definitely is made very apparent by all of the actors. So the actors in this show are fantastic. So Nick Offerman and Allison Pill both have gotten their time in the limelight, their time to shine. I mentioned Nick Offerman earlier, so I do want to talk about him right now as far as acting goes. I don't think I've ever really seen his dramatic chops, because obviously he is known for Parks and Recreation, which is a comedy, and he plays a very dry, very monotone character in that show, but it definitely is a comedic role. And here we get to see a very dramatic role that is really, really layered, with a lot of different types of performances. So he has to play the boss character. He plays a very emotionally driven character for much of the show. He definitely has those moments that show his anger or resentment to the world or other characters that create the villain status that he has. So he is fantastic. By far one of my favorite parts of the show, and an unexpected pick for this role that really, really paid off. I also am really happy that Sonoya Mizuno got the chance to play a lead role here, because she has been in a lot of films that you probably know about, but just has never really gotten the chance to play a lead. So she's very often been a background character. She is in Ex Machina in a non-speaking role. She's in La La Land as a dancer. She does mocap for a lot of films, including Annihilation. She was a doctor in Maniac. So she has been in lots and lots of projects, and finally getting to actually see her face, and hear her talk and actually act. Oh, well, okay. That may be offensive to a lot of different types of actors. So see her act in a much more pivotal plot or pivotal role to the story. So she is the lead in this series, and given that I had never seen her act in this type of a role before, I didn't even know it was her for a lot of it. And she also has a very layered performance that is pretty much so her and Nick Offerman's characters are foils to each other, and so getting to see how her motivations play out, and how she responds to things in a different way than Nick Offerman, that is also somewhat emotionally driven, but given her background as a coder, as a mathematician, she is much more somewhat deadpan, but just much more analytical, logical, and that's how she approaches a lot of these situations. And the moments where she may be rash or spontaneous come from different events in the series. So getting to see the layers of that performance through her was phenomenal. I think she really, really killed it in this role. I also like how almost everybody in the show, including those two lead actors, have a similar type of performance is a credit to the directing, but is also just a credit to the acting and how strong it is. A lot of the show is portrayed in a very calm, flat, monotone way. There are obviously lots and lots of moments that are higher in emotion. But I think the thing that stands out is how often there are moments of just these very plain, almost vacant performances that create an ominous tone and definitely translate to the story being much more focused on a logical, you could argue this, like a non-creative type of brain that is putting the performance forward. So I really like that is a steady sort of umbrella across the entire film, but I just think the acting here is really excellent because it's hard to make that so compelling, and the entire show is compelling, and that has to do both with the acting and the screenplay. Moving on to the production design, there's a very distinct yellow color palette through this entire series, and that's a pretty original color for film. There aren't a lot of films that focus on that color, both in the color grading and in the production design, the set decoration. So seeing that shine through so strongly and so consistently, I thought was a really excellent point for the production design. And I also really like how many of the sets here are fairly simple in structure. So just a lot of geometric shapes, just a lot of squares, and a lot of empty space. So a lot of the apartments are fairly vacant. The office spaces are very open and very plain almost, and so I think that the simplicity of the set makes room for the complexity of the story, which is something that I referenced in a previous film that I've talked about. I forget which one that was, but it's definitely very apparent here, and the sets just feel very empty and very open, which I think kind of adds to the tone of isolation and loneliness, which is definitely something that I resonated with when I watched the show. I'm sure many of you have recently as well. And so I just really thought that was a very strong emphasis that the set decoration and set had that I really, really liked and definitely benefited the show. But even though there's this distinct color palette that's focused on the color yellow, a lot of the lighting is still very dynamic and fairly diverse. So there's a lot of different sort of monochromatic lighting, a lot of primary colors that create these just very vibrant rainbow-esque moments. And then the moments that are yellow are accented with the lighting. Everything is very aesthetically strong. That plays into how well the cinematography gets to capture everything. I also think that there's a lot of creative imagery both in the set and in the cinematography. So the way a lot of non-traditional moments are framed. So there's a statue in this film that is a large toddler that is very ominous and very creepy. And I know that was CGI, but even still, the way that it's captured, the way that it's lit in different scenes is very strong. And I think that that is just an example, a much larger example of how that translates to the rest of the film and the rest of the series. I keep using film and series interchangeably because it really does feel like one coherent project. I think that the editing was also very strong because it's hard to keep a consistent pace in a miniseries because you have it spread out across so many episodes. But because those reveals happen so frequently and they're hidden so often, and then you get the big moments of reveal, the editing keeps that mystery intact. There tends to be some really excellent cliffhangers to accent each episode, which I really enjoyed. I also think that the use of montage in the beginning of a lot of episodes is fairly abstract. It draws a lot from avant-garde and experimental film, which I thought was really, really great for a fairly mainstream television show that kind of just is more focused on conveying its themes and its messages than an actual story in that moment, in the sort of the cold open of the show many times. It also never lingers on a scene too long. Every scene is fairly long, but it's paced very consistently through the dialogue and through the editing. And so no scene feels like it overstays its welcome. I was always enthralled, always drawn in from that scene. And so I think that it really cuts off most of the times at the exact right time when you feel as though the scene has had its conclusive narrative arc. And so that pacing is very, very thoughtful. The sound here is very abrasive, very intense, and is very in your face, and I loved it. When I first heard the score, it's so unique, and so unexpected for the type of drama that I was hearing. I honestly can't pick out what instrument it is. If you've seen the pilot or seen the show, you'll know kind of what I'm talking about. It's almost like I can't tell if it's a bell or a horn. Like, it's just a very loud, high-pitched, score. But it works so well to draw attention to itself and draw attention to the moments that should be caked in this feeling of sort of unease. And so I think that the score is phenomenal. So all of this is obviously a sort of reflection of the directing. So Alex Garland just has a very clear philosophy and message in mind that he wants to convey, focused on human interaction and technology and the intersection of the two. I also really like here how it's sort of a companion piece to Ex Machina. A little bit of a spoiler, so I will say skip ahead about 2 minutes if you don't want any spoilers. It's not actually a narrative spoiler. It's just something that I found that I really want to talk about because I've not gotten to talk about it with everybody. So I love Ex Machina, and there's a reveal so he had said for a long time that this was kind of a companion piece to Ex Machina, and narratively it definitely is, or thematically it is, narratively not necessarily. They don't seem to exist in the same world. But in the final episode, Nick Offerman's character is talking to Lily, our lead, and he says it's devs, but it's not actually devs. The V is a Roman numeral. Or a Roman character, which actually translates more closely to a U. So it would be Deus. And if you know the phrase Deus Ex Machina, they're paired together. And when he said that, I kind of lost my mind. I was like, oh my God, they're very linked. This is awesome. So I thought that was a really excellent part of the show that I really liked. So I think that this series is phenomenal. If you're in the mood for a sci-fi or a drama or just something somewhat intense, I would definitely recommend this one. It is a very heady show. It's very focused on its philosophy, very thoughtful. But that's not a turn off. That's a major, major benefit for me. I think it's very fun to think about, fun to talk about. So I loved Devs. I think it's my favorite series type thing that I've watched this year. So I'm going to give this one a strong 9 out of 10. I thought it was insanely excellent. I love Alex Garland, and I'm just so excited to see what he comes up with next, given that he just has hit it out of the park so strongly in his recent projects. So that's Devs. I'll now actually get on to some films. So the next one I'll be talking about is Dredd from 2013, which is an Alex Garland written film, a remake of Judge Dredd. Then I'll be talking about my recommendation, which is Ex Machina from 2015. And finally, I'm going to give some thoughts and feelings around the films that are coming out later on in this year in theaters. So that's the rest of the episode, but right now we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I've just given my review of Devs, the recent Hulu FX production. I'll now be talking about Dredd, a film from 2012. I'd said 2013 earlier. I was wrong. It's 2012. Then I'll be talking about my weekly recommendation, which is Ex Machina. And finally, I'll be talking about the films that are still slated to come out later this year. So Dredd is a first-time watch for me. It's something that had been on my list for a very long time. It's a remake of a film from the 90s, sort of a cult classic starring Sylvester Stallone. But it basically follows a police officer who, in this futuristic kind of apocalyptic reality, has the ability to act as judge, jury, and executioner. So they're called judges. And he takes on a new recruit as they try and take down a gang and a gang leader who is the manufacturer of a new drug taking over the city called Slow-Mo. So I did not quite enjoy this movie as much as I had wanted to. I thought that it definitely had some interesting moments. The aesthetic was very, very strong, and I think the film overall is still a fairly strong movie. But there was definitely something lacking here for me. So I just wanted to let you guys know that up front. And I think where it lacks the most is the screenplay. So starting with the positives, I do think the screenplay overall is fairly tight. So it's basically a bottle premise. I know many of you may know this, but a bottle premise is basically when a film or a television episode takes place all in one location. And the story kind of follows the arc that would take place, more focused on the characters in this location. So this one takes place in a large mega structure that is much larger than skyscrapers in this apocalyptic future. It can hold basically an entire city. I think they mentioned in this one it holds 75,000 people in a vertical structure because all of the land has been decimated. So I think it's fairly tight. It knows what it wants to do. It's about an hour 30. It all kind of exists in this one location, and I think that's definitely an interesting way to tell the story. I also think the world building is pretty solid, so there's a little bit of a voiceover narrative in the beginning and somewhat towards the end that can sometimes be deemed as a little lazy. I don't think it's lazy here, only because the world building is so strong in the visual aesthetic, and then you get told almost just precisely what you need to know. You don't get told anything that would further complicate things, and a lot of the world building is sort of left up to the imagination based on what we've been told or been shown. So I like that it's not necessarily throwing everything in our face here. It really trusts its audience to understand the world that we're living in and the characters that are experiencing it. Where the screenplay lacks for me, though, is that this is a very any apocalyptic future that is focused primarily on the state or the government that now runs this world is inherently going to be political. And even if it wasn't political, every film has a message or an agenda that it's trying to get across. And in this one, it just doesn't seem to have a clear message or a clear meaning. It gets very close to one many, many times. And especially a film about violence and the police in this context serving as people who can execute people on the spot. If there is any message, and I'm sure that there is, it's very, very subtle, and I think the moments that message should shine through should be highlighted a lot more, because many times it just seems as though it's an objective view of everything, and there is really no internal conflict, and any internal conflict should be sort of interpreted by the viewer, and nothing is really laid out in a positive or negative light. And it just doesn't feel like this movie has much to say, which is fairly disappointing for a movie of this caliber and for a movie of this topic and this theme. I definitely would have liked for it to be focused a lot more on the message than it ended up being. So that's my main gripe with the film, because a lot of the other aspects of it are actually very, very great. So Karl Urban plays our lead, Dredd, and his acting in this is superb. I think the thing that stands out the most about it is that you never see his eyes, so he has this mask on the whole time, and so you really only see his mouth, and his mouth the entire time has this like extremely intense scowl. And if you try on your own to like make a scowl look good, it's very difficult. And he nails it. And it's almost comical in the way that it appears on screen, but it so fits his character. And it just so fits the intensity of everything and just sort of the larger than life nature of a lot of things that are happening. So I really liked that touch. I think he was really great. I think all of the side characters here are excellent. I did particularly like Olivia Thirlby. Okay, I put the L in the wrong place. Who I had previously seen in Juno, but not much else. She's one of the leads. So obviously it's Dredd, so it's the titular character, but she is kind of the pseudo lead. I definitely find her character more interesting. I think the character has more to say in this film. And we actually get to see a lot more of the layered performance here. And I think all the performances are good, particularly hers, and Lena Headey's mama, because you can kind of see the internal conflict here. I don't know if that's just me trying to fill in gaps that the screenplay was not able to convey, or if that was, directing that was sort of portrayed that way, but a lot of it feels like it was a choice of the actors to portray a lot of these nuances and a lot of this internal conflict. So it really gives you a sense of inner depth that is lacking pretty bluntly in the screenplay, at least on a first watch. The production design here is very strong. So any apocalyptic world has to set itself apart. It's a genre that is fairly exhausted at this point, and a lot of them are fairly monotonous and fairly similar. So this one definitely has a very clear aesthetic. I really like its focus on like kind of a punk rock aesthetic. So influenced somewhat by steampunk, but overall it kind of takes the heavy metal aesthetic and puts that into the real world. I love the design of the helmets. It's a little bit of sort of a new age interpretation of the old design of the helmets. I think they look great. So just like all of the costuming is very visually appealing, and all of the design feels very coherent to everything else that's going on. It just feels all very messy, all very dirty. Which definitely fits that aesthetic of sort of the heavy metal punk rock. That was a very smart choice to take here. That is fairly original, I would say. Or at least original in the sense of like how heavy it is. So in a lot of other apocalyptic series, it is sort of it influences all of the design and the characters, but here it's definitely very, very apparent, which I think is a smart choice to go with. The cinematography I thought was also fairly strong. There weren't any majorly clear choices in just sort of the basic cinematography. So it is that bottle premise. So it's basically these two characters working their way up this mega structure to get to the boss, Mama. And if anything, I would have liked to see some longer takes, see some just long takes of action that would focus more on the actual hand-to-hand combat, or gun-to-gun combat. It's a very similar design as The Raid, which is a very popular action film that is a similar structure, as far as just like a work-your-way-up movie, very video game-esque. And that one focuses a lot on long takes, and a lot of hand-to-hand combat. So here there's a lot more guns, but even still, I think the cinematography is fairly strong. I do like that the slow-mo, the drug, actually does create everything in slow motion. It makes for some really interesting action set pieces that we may not get to see the action as much because of the fact that just guns are not nearly as dynamic for film as a lot of other forms of action and fighting styles, and so getting to actually see it in slow motion is really nice. I also just think the oversaturation of colors and sort of the sparkle that's put on it is a really nice touch. Definitely fits into basically a sort of the antithesis of the world that we're in right now. So I do really like it. Everything else sort of works in a gray, dark color palette, but because of the intensity and darkness of the story, I think that really, really works here. So I had said that the slow motion, so this is kind of moving on to editing, the slow-mo adds to those action set pieces, because I really just think gun violence is really difficult to capture in a compelling, interesting way. I'm much more interested in seeing hand-to-hand because that's just more, it takes a lot more effort, it's more dynamic. So the fact that most of this is gun-based is not quite as interesting. There are still some interesting moments, some pretty solid kills, some solid gore moments if you're into that. So I like how the slow-mo sort of makes those gun scenes more dynamic, but that doesn't happen all the time. So when it's not there, I just feel like those moments are somewhat lacking. Referencing the gore though, in a movie like this, I actually would have wanted it to go a little bit heavier with the gore, because obviously it's R-rated, it's focused a lot on action, it's focused on really the brutality and violence of this world. And so there are a lot of moments where it is almost really, really violent. There are some fairly violent moments, of course, but if you're into that sort of thing, I don't think this would really even scratch the surface of some of the more intense gore and violence. And there are some moments that I think really could have had some more creative, despite how morbid this is, some more creative deaths, some more creative, just practical effects, gore. There are some really great moments here, but I think it pulls back on some of those moments, so it's not like too intense, and I would have liked it to push that aesthetic even further, because of how heavy they're going with that punk rock look. But they're also going with a punk rock sound, so the score is very influenced by heavy metal and punk rock, and so that's very apparent. It really fits here. I think it's just obviously very cohesive. The sound design on the violence is also very strong. Nothing really feels silly or out of place. In a movie like this that is really focused on being edgy, I think the silliness would definitely take away from it. There are some sort of like cheesy lines that I think work pretty well here, but anything that would take you out of the intensity and edginess of the actual gore and violence, I think probably would have prohibited it from being what it is. And so I'm glad that the sound design is so strong. It's very loud, very intense, and so I really like that. So kind of moving on to the directing and sort of just overall, there's really no dissonance here. Everything is very cohesive, very coherent. There's a very strong aesthetic. I just wish that the message was a little bit stronger. I would have wanted it to be saying something a little bit stronger overall. And I think any of that message is watered down by just some of how everything plays out, how things are framed. Maybe on a couple watches, it's just really subtle, and I missed it on that first one, because I do think that there's a message and themes that you can draw from this, but there are some moments, particularly towards the end, where I really would have wished something would have moved a little bit differently, or resulted in a different result. So as to kind of change how these themes and messages are framed. But that's just me. I would have liked that to be a little bit more apparent. So that's the kind of major turnoff here for me. So I'm going to give this film a strong 6 to a soft 7, just because I think that's a pretty big glaring issue. Because it's kind of just a mindless or visually aesthetic action movie when it doesn't have sort of that political or social commentary. So that's Dredd. That's my opinion. I still would recommend seeing it. I do think it's a fun, intense action movie if you're into that sort of thing. So now we're going to move on to my weekly recommendation, which is Ex Machina, another Alex Garland film. And then stay tuned for the final segment where I talk about the upcoming films that are still slated to get released in 2020 and some of my thoughts and feelings on them. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of Devs, as well as my review of Dredd, and now I'll be giving my weekly recommendation, which is Ex Machina. In the final segment, stay tuned where I talk about my most anticipated films that are still slated to come out in 2020 and just overall what's getting released. So this one is Ex Machina. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It is one of my favorite films of all time. It's another Alex Garland film. I think it's his first major directorial debut. Yeah, this is the first big producer, director. Yeah, it's his directorial debut. Which is a phenomenal debut right out the gate. But it basically follows Caleb, who is a programmer at a tech company who wins a company-wide contest to meet the secluded CEO Nathan as he attempts to create the world's first high-functioning AI and enlists Caleb in a sort of Turing test to determine whether the AI works. So it's a very simply laid out sci-fi premise. It stars a lot of Alex Garland alums, including Domhnall Gleeson, who was in Dredd, and Sonoya Mizuno, who was in Devs. But then it also employs Oscar Isaac and Alicia Vikander. Alicia Vikander plays the AI mentioned before, Ava, and Oscar Isaac plays Nathan. So the cast is very, very small. Obviously there's a few others, but that's just sort of the core cast that exists in the majority of the film. And it's also, because it's somewhat of a simple premise, the themes and morality, is very clearly laid out here. And it's really supposed to be a character exploration in response to that theme. So the screenplay here is super strong. It's really focused on showing, not telling. It really tries to get its message across in as few words as possible. This is made very apparent if you look at the script. The opening scene with Caleb riding in the helicopter, with just sort of the helicopter pilot to fly over Nathan's estate. in the original script, it's about 2 pages of expositional dialogue, and then in the final film, it's basically 2 lines that get the exact point across, and anything that's missed is portrayed in either the scene prior or the scene later. So everything here is really focused on getting the most efficient sort of bang for its buck as far as dialogue goes, which I think is how most films should function, and here it works extremely well. And everything else is somewhat dialogue heavy between the characters, because it's really a character piece, very theatrical in that way. And every character has a very strong sense of motivations and moral compass, and they're very different from each other. And watching all 3 of them sort of manipulate each other in their own sort of social ways to gain what they want to gain is very interesting because of how clearly it's laid out through the screenplay and through the acting. Also, just kind of my favorite aspect of this is that it's basically a modern day retelling of Frankenstein, which I think is awesome. It's one of those things that if Frankenstein was not in the public domain, and Mary Shelley's estate sued Ex Machina, maybe you could prove that it's not based on Frankenstein, but given that it's in the public domain, you don't really have to worry about that. It is pretty apparent that this is kind of a modern day retelling, and really similar morality themes here, message being conveyed, sort of focused on what makes a person, the idea of gods and monsters, just philosophy and existentialism in general. So that's very apparent in here, which is pretty reflective of the original Frankenstein story too, which I think is really fascinating. The acting here is absolutely wonderful. It's a knockout performance from all 3 of these main characters. You can kind of rewatch this film many, many times and notice something different in all of their performances because of how you know the story is progressing, and you can see sort of the minor nuances of how these characters are really manipulating each other in a social sense. And so all of these performances are really focused on those small moments between each other, and so the relationships and the chemistry are really at its best in this film. Similar to Devs, the design and the production design, the mise en scène is very simple. It's also fairly not empty, but just very open, very vacant, which is a similar idea that's getting conveyed as Devs. But in here, it's also very sleek and very modern, which is fairly reflective of just modern day aesthetic, and sort of the reflection of that on technology, because that's sort of the aesthetic that technology, a lot of cell phones, smartphones, new laptops focus on, having that very sleek, modern look, which creates sort of this kind of off-putting sense of, or just very isolating, non-human, very just cold feeling throughout the entire film. It's really just off-putting in the best way possible. The design of Ava, too, is excellent. It's really the perfect integration of technology, and humanity. It really just shows the bare minimum that you need to see to really distinguish them as a person, and then everything else just looks really, really excellent. I mean, the visual effects here won an Oscar when it was nominated against Star Wars and Marvel. So the VFX and the design overall is really excellent and just adds so much to the movie. The cinematography here too, I really like, because it's so focused on its themes and its message, the juxtaposition between sort of this sleek, cold aesthetic of technology and the natural landscapes around them, and just sort of the idea of creation and humanity and naturalism. And so pairing these two in a visual sense and not making that super overt, I think is a really genius way to get some of these messages across. And then as far as capturing a lot of just the human moments here, because the whole film is centered on the relationships and the chemistry between these characters, the camera really lingers on reactions a lot of the time. Scenes tend to end far after dialogue has ended, and it's focusing on the facial expressions and just sort of the inner monologue of specific characters. So it's really focused on the reaction of things. Many times characters are shown when they're not speaking, and characters who are speaking aren't even shown because it's more focused on the character listening, which I think is a really fascinating tool used from the camera, and ends up creating just a very reflective cinematography like palette. So going back a little bit, in terms of the editing with Ava's design, the VFX integration here is flawless. Like, there really is no uncanny valley. There's no apparent sort of abnormality with the visual effects and the CGI and then the actual real physical things on the set. So it definitely makes sense that it won best visual effects here. So it's just a flawless, seamless sort of integration of those two mediums. I also think that the editing is really excellent, similar to Dev's, that it really, the editing and the pacing speeds up pretty distinctly by the time we get to about 45 minutes left. The narrative ramps up in a thriller way, and so the pacing and the editing ramps up with it, which you wouldn't be able to have that narrative ramp up if you didn't have the editing reflecting that. So I think that's obviously very important. Comparing this to its companion piece, Dev's, the score here is much softer. It's much less in your face. It's much more focused on sort of blending into the background, which I think definitely kind of goes along with a lot of the other aspects of the film. And it also just is really beautiful. It's focused on sort of these high-pitched chimes, which I think is sort of subconsciously, sort of a reflection of almost femininity. It's very light and very airy, and I think is supposed to, this is mainly focused obviously on the Ava theme, and Ava obviously uses her femininity pretty clearly, pretty overtly in this movie, and so I think having the score reflect that is really important to establish some of these gender dynamics that are not quite as apparent for the message of the movie, but you can definitely notice the not rejection of, but the critique of masculinity in the two main human characters, and then how they're manipulated by a character who is very, very much not using masculine traits. So I think that's really interesting, and it's kind of reflected here in the score. Alex Garland just really has a strong eye for sci-fi, very strong sense of a message and a theme, and I think sci-fi a lot of times is where that is conveyed the most as a genre, because it's so focused on how humanity can progress in the future. The fact that you linger and focus on different philosophical ideas and themes is sort of inevitable for the genre, and I think he works so well in this genre. And you really get a sense of conclusion even though he doesn't answer every question, which I think is really nice because you really feel the ending of the film. It doesn't feel like it's out of place. It doesn't feel like it's abrupt. But then because of the fact that these are such big ideas, he can't answer them, obviously. He has some ideas of them, but most of them should be interpreted by the audience. So I just think he's a very strong sense of all that, and it really comes into play the most in this film. So I love Ex Machina. I've seen it many, many times. It is free on Netflix right now, so I strongly recommend you watch it. I think it's in my top, 10, top 5 even. I saw it in theaters with no context as to what it was, and it just blew me out of the water. So I love this film. I'm going to give this one a solid 10 out of 10. So go check out Ex Machina. Could not recommend it highly enough. And just check out a lot of Alex Garland's stuff. I think Dredd, maybe not my favorite, but overall he tends to hit on most of his projects. So those are my reviews of Dev's, Dredd, and Ex Machina. And now make sure you stay tuned for the final segment where I talk about the upcoming films of 2020 that are still slated to be released, and then just some of my thoughts and feelings around them. So stay tuned for that while we take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I've given my reviews of Devs, Dredd, and Ex Machina, some of my favorite Alex Garland projects, and now I'm going to be running down the movies that are still slated to be released in 2020. So I kind of didn't want to prepare for this segment because I thought it would be fun to pull up a list. This list is updated as of today, August 4th, and so I kind of wanted to pull it up, check out what movies were coming out and just some of my sort of off-the-cuff initial feelings of them, what I already know about them. And I thought it would be fairly enlightening both for kind of all of us because I still don't really know what movies are slated to come out. And if you guys want to know which ones are still potentially coming to theaters, this is the list for you because theaters right now aren't even open. So this is obviously subject to change, but as of August 4th, this is what's coming out and the dates that they are coming out. So first up on this list is Mulan. This one was slated for March 2020 and it got moved a bunch. It moved to August and now is sort of unspecified as to when it's going to come to theaters. But it's mainly focused on the U.S. and Chinese market for this film. That's where it's going to get most of its money. So obviously wants to have most of those two countries reopened. And right now that obviously is not the case. I have seen though that it is supposed to come to Disney Plus September 4th. I believe it's either the 4th or the 1st. But it's for rent for like $30. So that's not necessarily a viable option for lots of people. But hopefully that will be coming to theaters when theaters do reopen. Next up on this list is The French Dispatch, which was originally slated for July 2020 and has now just been moved indefinitely. It's unknown when it's going to come out. That is Wes Anderson's newest project. It kind of has with a lot of, Wes Anderson movies, it has a star-studded cast. It's got Timothée Chalamet, Bill Murray, Saoirse Ronan, Tilda Swinton, Frances McDormand, lots and lots of people in that cast. So that's one that I'm fairly interested in. I am a Wes Anderson fan. I wouldn't call myself a big Wes Anderson fan. I haven't seen a lot of his early stuff. I just have enjoyed almost all of the movies that I've seen from him. I think he has obviously a very strong visual aesthetic. I really like him. And so I'm definitely interested to see what this movie is. But right now, we don't know what's going to come out. Next up on this list is Antebellum, which is a horror movie starring Janelle Monáe. It was originally slated for April 21st. It's now supposed to come out August 21st. So hopefully that will still come out as long as theaters open. It might be one of those movies that theaters kind of run with as their first major release. I'm definitely very interested in this movie. So it's produced by Jordan Peele and is a racially charged horror film that's sort of focused on modern day women kind of grappling with the generational trauma of slavery in the United States. It's definitely a very timely film for some of the events happening right now. I'm very intrigued by it. I think that there's a couple movies recently that are focused on the Black experience in sort of a horror format, which is similar to, or at least kind of takes influence from Afro-Surrealism, which I had talked about in about a month ago. So I'm very intrigued by this movie. I do hope that it still comes out, and if it does, it'll be out August 21st. Another movie for August 21st is called Tesla, where Ethan Hawke plays the inventor Nikola Tesla, and that one did very well at Sundance. I don't know a lot else about this film, but I do know that it is currently slated to come out video on demand, and I think as long as theaters reopen, it'll still try and get a limited theatrical release on August 21st. Next up is Tenet, the just sort of infamous release date film, because Christopher Nolan is not somebody that is going to sacrifice his film for video on demand. So this one was originally supposed to come out in July, then it got moved back to different dates in August, and right now it is going to be released internationally on August 26th, and it'll be in select U.S. cities the next coming weekend. So that's obviously barring the opening of certain theaters. So this is something that AMC in particular, but theaters in general, were kind of focusing on this film being its first major release once they reopened, maybe because of the fact that Christopher Nolan is just a big blockbuster seller, and there weren't a lot of other films that sort of fit that bill, sort of when theaters were planning on reopening. So I would definitely expect to see this film this year, because I mean, personally, this is sort of early August speculation, and maybe I will have egg on my face later on, but I don't think theaters will stay closed for the entirety of this year. I just ultimately don't think that they can financially handle that. Whether or not cases go up or down, I think that they're going to reopen sometime around September, and I do expect to see this film in theaters in 2020. Next up, baby, we got New Mutants, the movie that I kind of laughed at a week ago. Definitely still find it kind of humorous about how many times this film has gotten delayed. Originally slated for 2017, 2018, and now it is August 2020, and it is still getting delayed for like the 6th or 7th time. So right now it's slated for August 28th. This is another film that I expect to be seeing in 2020. I also wouldn't be surprised if this one gets a Disney Plus release because of the fact that it's not currently a part of the MCU. I will say that one of my sort of like conspiracy theories is that this one might be integrated into the MCU because of the fact that it's young kids being mutants. You could easily run with some of these characters being some of the new X-Men for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but that's all speculation. Don't take any of that as any fact. That's just me. But because of the fact that it is not currently an MCU film, and Fox doesn't really exist anymore, and Disney's not the one that pumped a bunch of money into making this movie, I would not be surprised if this one gets released for just home video Disney Plus for free. So otherwise, it'll get released on August 28th in theaters as long as theaters are open. I'm going to stop saying that. We know that, as long as theaters are open. But this one I would definitely expect to see this year. So the next one is an example of a lot of other films that are coming out that are slated for a certain date, and if theaters are open, they'll be coming out in theaters. Otherwise, they will definitely be coming out video on demand. So this one is Bill and Ted Face the Music, which is slated for September 1st. This project has been in the works for a couple years now. It is a curious premise. I'm definitely a little bit intrigued by it. Not something that I expect to be all that just all that solid of a movie. I think it'll be fun, kind of enjoyable popcorn flick, which is why I would hope that it's a theatrical release. But regardless, it'll get released on September 1st. Alright, now we're getting into some other heavy hitters. This one is The Kingsman, which is a spin-off / prequel of the Kingsman series. So this one is like The Kingsman, like it's not Kingsman. So it's supposed to be the origin of the secret society of the Kingsmen. And it was slated for earlier this year. It was mainly, I think it was supposed to come out like March, April, and then obviously got pushed, so now it is slated for September 18th. This is something that I'm definitely very intrigued by because of the fact that a lot of films just end up getting like mindless sequels, mindless spin-offs that kind of don't have anything to do with the source material or just don't have that same tone. I think this is a really interesting route to take it. There's so many different World War I movies coming out, right, or that have come out in the past couple of years, and I think this is definitely a very intriguing take. I like that it's sort of characters that we don't even really know anything about. Just sort of a new story overall, adding some context to the world of the Kingsmen. So I'm very curious about this film, and I do think that it could be really, really good. Next up is a very, very big heavy hitter, which is Wonder Woman 1984, a movie that I was very excited for because I loved the first Wonder Woman. My only main gripe was sort of the final act. It's a film that I would actually like to review in the future. I might do it when Wonder Woman 84 comes out. But Wonder Woman 1984 was originally slated for June 2020. It was supposed to be a big summer blockbuster, DC's big release this year, and unfortunately it got pushed back to October 2nd. But this is a movie that predates a lot of the other DC movies, so Wonder Woman kind of makes her big debut in Batman v Superman. Wonder Woman obviously was a prequel to that, taking place in World War I. This one is making a big time jump, but still before all that for 1984, and it kind of has the I think it's sort of the last leg of that 80s nostalgia in pop culture. Obviously that's always going to be there, but like the big resurgence, Stranger Things type, I think this is sort of the last hurrah of the 80s as far as pop culture 30-year cycles go. We're going to get into the 90s, baby. And speaking of 90s, a 1992 remake of Candyman, the horror movie, is slated for October 16th. It was originally supposed to come out in June. I actually think this one makes a lot of sense to come out in October. It's a horror movie, so definitely a big thing coming out here. It's another kind of racially charged horror movie. The folklore kind of exists in that realm. It always has. That's the film from the 90s. This one is also produced, it's actually written, by Jordan Peele, which is very, very fascinating. He's obviously a phenomenal writer-director, so I'm very curious to see Candyman. I thought it had an excellent trailer, so be on the lookout for that one. Let's get a few more movies in here, before I wrap this episode up. Another big blockbuster is Black Widow. This one is obviously a prequel, kind of. It's supposed to take place in between Civil War and Infinity War, sort of Black Widow's extra things once the Avengers broke up. It's something that I'm not overly excited about, only because I have never been all that intrigued by Black Widow as a character. I think that the writers for each film early on in the MCU kind of didn't know which direction to go with her character, and therefore she ends up getting kind of muddled and overall just somewhat uninteresting. I do think having a solo movie for added context is also really good, but it does feel a little bit too little too late given the events of Endgame. But still interested in seeing it. Obviously, I'm a big Marvel fan. I also think it feels a little bit too big of a mission for sort of like a solo spy project, at least from the trailers. Would have been nice to have maybe a smaller spy thriller, maybe more attuned to the Winter Soldier for this movie. But I do like the visual aesthetic. I also am very interested to see Taskmaster, a big Marvel comic villain in the MCU. So that's something that I'm excited about. This is another movie that I wouldn't be overly surprised if it gets released on Disney Plus. I don't think it's likely that it'll be released on Disney Plus, but if things continue on this path and movie theaters don't open, or at least don't open to the capacity that Marvel or Disney would want, this is one of those movies that is not super duper important, at least from what I can tell, to Phase 4 of the MCU, given that it's a character that won't probably exist in Phase 4 of the MCU. So this one could probably get released on Disney Plus, but regardless, I'd be on the lookout. I think it'll be a fun movie no matter what. So let's finish this up. The last movie that I'll talk about, which is the one that I'm probably most excited for, is Soul, Pixar's newest film that's slated for November 20th, 2020. It was supposed to be June, this past June, but obviously didn't happen. So here, it's Pixar's second release of the year, actually. And given how, surprised I was by Onward, this film, is based on a real guy, who worked at a school in New York City. So I actually know some people who know him, or know of him at the very least. So this film, I think, is just sort of a fun premise. I like the visual aesthetic. I like the musical score, or at least kind of the emphasis on music in this one. I think it'll have some really interesting existential ideas. And because of the fact that I thought that Onward was so good when I didn't expect it to be, hopefully because I'm expecting this one to be a little bit better, it just looks more interesting, it'll be great. So that's my hope. So that's all I'm going to do today. Maybe I'll continue this segment later on in the year when we have some more information on some of the movies that are coming out, and maybe when we get some more trailers. But that's today's episode. I hope that you liked it. I'm sorry that I was a little bit lower energy today. Allergy season, it can get rough. And I am obviously in the mindset of getting everything out of the house and moving it to a brand new apartment. So reminder that I will not be having an episode this coming week, or this coming weekend. I'm not going to have one on Sunday. But I will be back obviously next Wednesday. So I will be coming back, only missing 1 week. And either way, I would highly recommend listening to Shub and Elizabeth's episodes if you are not already. But as always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.